Now, genocide is a problem in two ways. Not only the terrible fact of mass death, but also how the relatively new idea and law of genocide organizes and distorts our thinking about civilian, that is, non-combatant destruction. Taking the normative perspective of civilian immunity from military attack that international law and norms ostensibly prioritize, this book argues that their implicit hierarchy, atop of which sits genocide as the crime of crimes, blinds us to other types of humanly caused civilian death, like bombing cities and the collateral damage of missile and drone strikes, blockades, and sanctions. In other words, talk of genocide functions ideologically to detract from systematic violence against civilians perpetrated by governments, including Western ones. This book also contends that this violence is a consequence of what I call permanent security imperatives, which means the striving of states and armed groups who seek to found states to make themselves invulnerable to threats. Permanent security is the unobtainable goal of absolute safety that necessarily results in civilian casualties by its paranoid tendency to indiscriminate violence. Now, to solve the problems of genocide, concealing permanent security, my book proposes replacing the former with the latter. So we should disband with genocide as a concept and law and replace it with permanent security. Now, indiscriminate is aerial bombing of any type, which is no trivial matter if protecting non-combatants is a civilized norm, as long claimed by Western states. The United States, let us not forget, dropped 8 times more bomb tonnage in Indochina during the Vietnam War than in World War II, killing 2 or 3 million people, mainly civilians. When Western publics recoiled in horror from these often televised destructive images in this war, air forces moved to more accurate technologies, namely guided missiles. Even then, military strategists and lawyers acknowledged that the collateral damage of so-called surgical strikes, which drone operators cynically call bug splat, is unavoidable, if regrettable. It's no surprise then that US forces were responsible for almost half the civilian casualties in Afghanistan in 2019, dropping more ordnance on that country in that year than in all previous ones, hoping to bomb the enemy to the negotiation table as they did in Vietnam in the early 70s. The weapons are good, but the tactics and the civilian instruction continues as before. Now, in the spirit of making careful distinctions, commentators insist that such civilian destruction cannot be compared to genocide because the purpose of the latter is to destroy peoples, whereas military action aims only to defeat enemies, even if killing some civilians in the process is inevitable. Now, to this objection, I respond thus. Why privilege the intention of states and their armed forces? I dispute the doctrine of double effect, famously formulated by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, to the effect that killing as a side effect of a good end is permissible. What does it matter to civilians if they're killed by violence inflicted with genocidal or military intent? And what if global policing is intrinsic to national security policy, thereby entailing constant military action, the infinity, forever, endless, or permanent wars in which some states are engaged? And I take those terms from the titles of books which have been published on US foreign policy over the last few years. Such wars, these infinity wars, are enabled by the use of drones and missiles, which shift the risk from armed personnel to enemy non-combatants, resulting in repeated small-scale massacres. Now, drone and missile use has increased since late 2001 with the US's global war on terror in the Middle East and Asia, in which some 800,000 people have died, of whom some 335,000 were civilians. In these circumstances, the continuous killing of civilians becomes the norm rather than confined to occasional wars. They are casualties of mowing the grass, as Israeli security analysts call the long-term strategy of attrition designed to debilitate the enemy capacities of Hamas in this case, in what they call a protracted, intractable conflict. Now, in practice, civilian casualties are routinely and cumulatively caused by this strategy. And some scholars say that mowing the grass has effectively become not only the new Western way of war, but of modern warfare itself, as the Russian and Syrian bombing of targets in Syria also indicate. Now, the principle of civilian immunity is the presumption of civilian innocence. Military thinkers and international lawyers have wrestled with the conundrum of observing that 20th century warfare was total, whether enlisting entire populations in the two world wars or in internal armed conflicts like civil wars. Total warfare, they suggest, means that, say, factory workers and their families contribute to the war effort as much as soldiers on the front. So they're not so innocent and therefore legitimate targets. To insist on the tidy distinction between combatants and civilians, they say, is outmoded. But I say, if civilians are not immune, they are effectively presumed guilty by association with enemy combatants, including, say, neutral humanitarian personnel providing medical assistance to designated terrorists, not to mention so-called human shields. In that case, we are verging on the mental world of genocide, entire peoples as enemies whose members are collectively guilty, or at least expendable. Is it to conceal this murderous assumption in military strategy and international law that civilian destruction needs to be genocidal to shock the conscience of mankind, to invoke the antiquated language of humanitarian declarations? And furthermore, is that why such mass violence needs to resemble the Holocaust to be recognizable as genocide? Now, these are some of the problems of genocide I deal with in the book, but there are others. The United Nations related investigations adhere so strictly to international law's narrow definition of genocide that cases like Darfur and Sudan, which really closely resemble the Armenian genocide in many respects, are effectively downgraded to the less grave legal category of crimes against humanity. More recently, in June 2016, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Syria issued a report accusing Islamic State of genocide against the Yazidi minority in Iraq and Syria. And then, pursuant to a Human Rights Council mandate to investigate violations of international law in Syria, the Commission had issued many other reports critical of all civil war players, but only this one on genocide made headlines. The genocide determination captured attention more because of its special status and rarity than to ISIS's spectacular atrocities. Now, this problem is founded on a conceptual one, distinguishing genocide from non-international armed conflict, or civil war, rebellion, insurgency, and belligerency, and state conflict. Now, since its appearance in international law in the late 40s, genocide has been conceived as a crime committed by one state or parastate forces against another civilians or against a hapless ethnic minority within its own borders. And according to the UN Convention, it is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Now, that means political enemies like, say, communists are not covered by the convention, leading scholars to engage in contentious conceptual innovation to subsume political violence into the genocide category. And there's a whole cottage industry of this in South America, for example, trying to turn the political violence against the junta's enemies, who are mainly leftists, into victims of genocide. Now, although there are no legal barriers to identifying genocide within civil wars, political discourse commonly distinguishes them because armed conflict suggests belligerent symmetry, whereas genocide is imagined as asymmetrical violence against the civilian members of ethnic groups. The distinction between genocide and political violence, I think, blinds us to civilian destruction in general and the circumstances that produce it. Accordingly, state violence can be excused as legitimately political, that is, motivated by security concerns, rather than as illegitimately ethnic in motivation. That is, by defining genocide in such narrow terms, governments can undertake drastic measures against population groups in the name of security, self-preservation, military necessity, and opposing terrorists. The Assad regime in Syria has been doing so for years, just as the Sudanese government attacked a section of its population in the Darfur region in 2005. Consequently, in response to the accusation that Myanmar is committing genocide by driving some 750,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh with wanton violence, its leaders denounced them as Bengali terrorists. And some Western commentators effectively agree with the Myanmar state by insisting on the purity of the genocide concept, meaning its approximation to the Holocaust. It was wrong to pin the label of genocide in this campaign against the Rohingya, declared the former New York Times journalist and now foreign policy pundit Stephen Kinzer. Not all atrocities are genocide, he said. This was a civil war rather than a genocidal conjuncture. Now, the vexed relationship between the categories of genocide and civil war, or non-international armed conflict, as Common Article 3 of the Fourth Geneva Conventions refers to the latter, is an urgent problem, given that the majority of post-World War II conflicts have been internal to states, and that civilians are now the majority of victims of armed conflict. Now, this conceptual problem is particularly intractable in the new wars that have emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, that refers to Mary Kaldor's work. With their multiple internal and external state and private actors driven by predatory political economies of semi-organized criminality, these wars do not map onto the melodramatic binary of victims and perpetrators, goodies and baddies, required by the genocidal optic. For this reason as well, the multi-directional violence in Congo that's resulted in over 3 million deaths and 4.5 million refugees is all but ignored by scholars of genocide. Overall then, patterns of civilian destruction since the Second World War resemble more the violence of imperial expansion and consolidation that's marked human relations for the millennia. Yet international law since the Second World War takes genocide as a threshold of violence to be proscribed and prosecuted. As a consequence, journalists feel compelled to make genocidal allusions to gain humanitarian attention for suffering of civilians in the bombing of, say, besieged cities in the Middle East these days. And they do so because such a narrow definition of genocide downgrades, if not screens out, more common and equally destructive human losses. Indeed, the fetish of genocide as the crime of crimes effectively licenses rather than proscribes many forms of violence against civilians. Finally, the concept of genocide presumes the existence of identity-based groups as the building blocks of humanity that are targeted on the basis of their identity, by racial, ethnic, or religious hatred, as the Genocide Convention puts it. In this categorization, populations comprise ethnic majorities and minorities as political facts. They're understood as political agents with ontological status rather than as the outcome of complex processes of racialization. Now, this presupposition of fixed identities flies in the face of the fact that people have multiple and layered identities. It also ignores that religious difference only becomes a public political identity in particular circumstances. When politics is imagined in sectarian terms, as ethnic struggle, which Lemkin was effectively positing, we are inhabiting the mental world of genocide rather than thinking beyond it. Another problem of genocide, then, is its participation in the discursive construction of identity-based violence against civilians. Now, given these problems, I suggest in this book that the genocide concept, as I said, should be replaced with a more general crime of permanent security. I'm not going to get a chance to talk about that really much in this presentation, but I can flesh it out in the discussion. Now, to that end, we need to understand how our categories and imagination of mass criminality produce this moral hierarchy, with genocide at the top, this lamentable hair-splitting in discussions about civilian destruction and the occlusion of permanent security, these problems of genocide. Now, this book questions the comforting story of moral and legal progress about the genocide concept and law that dominates academic and public understandings of mass criminality and international order. Unlike these accounts of the genocide concept and associated jurisprudence, which suppose they are taming Leviathan, I argue that the Genocide Convention at once preserved military necessity in the conduct of warfare and the ability of states to suppress domestic opposition. Contrary to the proclaimed historical lessons about ubiquitous and deadly identity-based violence, a broader view of civilian destruction indicates that declarations of national emergencies and proclamations of security threats are the real driver of permanent security. Let me just fix up a typo. Yet politically motivated violence does not shock the conscience of mankind. Now, this disastrous outcome was not implicit in Lemkin's claim that civilian immunity was his basic premise. He began his justification of the genocide concept in promising terms when he declared that the distinction between civilians and combatants was elemental to the crime of genocide. And I quote him now: "The antithesis of the Rousseau-Portalis doctrine, which may be regarded as implicit in the Hague regulations, holds that war is directed against sovereigns and armies, not against subjects and civilians. In its modern application in civilized society, the doctrine means that war is conducted against states and armed forces and not against populations." So here Lemkin declared that criminality was defined as warfare waged against populations rather than armies. Today, customary international humanitarian law refers to the principle of distinction or discrimination for this distinction. Indeed, Westerners have long declared that their mode of warfare was civilized and humanitarian because of this distinction. But then Lemkin and the UN specified genocide as national, ethnic, racial, and religious, excluding other categories of civilians. The convention thus defines genocide, as I said, as the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, or racial or religious group. Now, although UN delegates did not use the term Holocaust, they were acutely conscious of the Nazis' extermination policies against Jews and defined genocide to capture their extremity and, above all, racial focus and ideological motivation. Leaders of smaller European nations subject to Nazi occupation also regarded German policies as an attack on their nationality, whether, say, Poles and Czechoslovaks. Now, using this imaginary of ultimate criminality, genocide was depoliticized by being defined as murderous attacks on people solely on the basis of their hated group membership, merely for who they are. Now, this definition ensured that a state could avoid, as I've said, committing genocide by claiming to act for political strategic purposes. And as a consequence, we think more about the victims of genocide during World War II than the overall civilian casualties, a staggering 30 million people. Now, while the targeting of nationalities as such accounts for much of this number, so genocide, other categories of civilians were as much victims of all powers' strategies of annihilation, as one historian puts it. What is more, Lemkin and his supporters ignored the international debate since the 1920s about the efficacy of a new technology with terrifying potential, aerial warfare. The strategic bombing of civilian populations was intended to destroy enemy industrial capacity and morale, meaning that the enemy was conceptualized as a national whole, as I've already mentioned, thereby eliding the distinction between combatants and civilians. He likewise, over the insignificant debate in the League of Nations about wartime blockades of countries that led to mass starvation in Germany and Lebanon during the First World War. Instead of following his premise about civilian immunity in the face of epochal changes in the relationship between warfare and civilian immunity, Lemkin fixated on national, ethnic, and religious groups as victims of massive hate crimes. And consequently, he did not develop a framework that also included the targeting of entire peoples as military objectives in armed conflict. His imaginary of humanity as an ensemble of peoples with unique national spirits was in fact a product of his intensive Zionism, itself a version of small nations consciousness with its intense attachment to vulnerable cultural identity. And we've adopted this ethnic national human ontology and made it the barely acknowledged basis of the hierarchy of criminality. And this adoption, of course, I think is one of the problems of genocide. I've got another page or two. How am I doing for time, Sophie?
Go on, Dirk. Yeah, you can.
Okay,
yes.
I'm nearly done. Now, the ethnic definition of genocide is compounded by its conceptualization as an irrational hate crime. Innocent, blameless victims are attacked for racial rather than political reasons, for who they are and not for what they or members of their group have done. Primordial antipathy or ideological driven racism, instead of rational political considerations, are supposed to motivate the perpetrator in this approach. In law and popular culture, then, genocide is a crime against identity. And this understanding of genocide, of course, is indexed to its archetype, the Holocaust. If the Holocaust is unique, as often asserted, it is because European Jews were not engaged in an uprising against Nazi rule. They were politically innocent, heightening the evil of their persecution. They did not provoke it. They were murdered out of pure hate, according to this kind of reasoning. Now, No state or parastate admits a hateful motivation, of course. Instead, they claim they kill and deport opponents who are threatening and dangerous for defensive political reasons. Even the Nazis did so, actually, if you look closely. Security and racial animus intersects, as I argue later in this book. Now, this misleading binary thus distinguishes between genocide and armed conflict in the following way. Whereas genocide is understood as asymmetrical warfare against a passive ethnic group or people who are thus deemed innocent, civil war and insurgency are armed conflicts in which all parties possess agency and are thus not entirely blameless for violence that befalls them. In doing so, this distinction effectively criminalizes entire groups, although the vast majority of its members will be non-combatants. What is more, in reality, security and hatred accompany one another, as I mentioned. Now, politically rather than racially defined victims are effectively assigned a lower status in this hierarchy of criminality. International law and popular culture regard genocide and its archetype, the Holocaust, as the ultimate violation, as I've posited. The result is not only to trivialize war crimes and crimes against humanity, but, as I've been suggesting, to exclude the aerial bombing of civilians, which likewise violates the principle of distinction and is sometimes quite deadly. Few recall that the USA relentlessly bombed North Korean cities and transport infrastructure during the Korean War between 1950 and 1953, killing over 20% of the population. Now, although Lemkin himself understood the genocide concept as a constructed artifice, that is, it was a composition that was a composite violation that bundled existing crimes on the basis of their underlying tension, he thought that it reflected a recurring reality, the destruction of ethno-cultural groups as historical reality. In doing so, he did not understand that genocide is in fact a generative notion. Through the magic of concepts, scholars create their object of inquiry by retrospectively imposing a genocide ideal typical definition on the past, thereby discovering cases. In this way, supposed instances of a stable phenomena can be traced throughout history, giving the illusion of continuity and objectivity to arbitrary choices made in the present. So, for example, why are the cases of Biafra and East Pakistan routinely excluded from genocide studies, but Cambodia included? And why is the unimaginable mortality of the Chinese Great Leap Forward excluded? You'll never see that on a syllabus of genocide studies, although mortality exceeds the others in the post-war period that are on the syllabus. So most civilian destruction in the second half of the 20th century is excluded by fixating on genocide as a non-political crime of racial hatred. Lemkin did not foresee that his creation would distort our criminal vocabulary with its paralyzingly monumental status as the crime of crimes that screens out other violations of the principle of distinction. I asked then, why have we inherited genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and crimes against peace as the language of transgression? To invoke one of the subtitles of my book, namely that upper threshold of mass criminality. It's the matrix of words and concepts that have been used to define and police that threshold of that which shocks the conscience of mankind, to invoke that common phrase in international legal documents. Shock, conscience, humanity, barbarism, civilization. The fact that diplomats continue to resort to this vocabulary today means that they're still speaking about political evil with the venerable language of transgression, which in the book I trace back to the 16th century, believe it or not. Many international lawyers, political scientists, ethicists, and others routinely invoke these keywords as natural categories, which I think is a problem. If they have histories, they are constituents, according to these scholars, of an imagined civilizing process that culminates in the contemporary legal regime regulating armed conflict. They ask, what shocks the conscience of mankind today, and how can we intervene to stop it? Instead, I ask, as an historian, who defines these categories? From which vista does humanity, whatever that is, look out across the global landscape of transgression? According to what hierarchy of values and assumptions does it orient its conscience, whatever that is? And according to what constellation in the history of emotions does it feel shock? What are the cultural and geopolitical processes that constitute their contested meanings? Who has the ability to arrogate to themselves the right to incarnate and define humanity and civilized conscience? What actions and processes are screened out by setting an upper level of transgression that shocks the conscience of mankind? In sum, how is the greatest political evil named and defined? Now, I'll finish now, meaning that I don't get to elaborate on a lot of these points, but we can do so in the discussion. I look forward to your comments, and thanks again for listening.
Am I on?
Yeah, you are on. Yeah.
You see me? Okay, I don't see
Yeah.
myself. The this is a very challenging paper, and I hope to do two things. One, to highlight for a few minutes Dirk's argument, and then to ask some questions about it. Dirk, I don't remember Dirk's original visit to me. I do remember we were together in Florence, the NYU campus there, to discuss genocide several years ago. And in fact, I gave a paper. I was very exercised in 2005. I went to Sydney for the International Historians Conference and gave a paper on the issue of mass bombing, which I may come back to briefly. Dirk argues that, I wonder whether I can, how do I see myself at the same time I see, okay. Dirk argues that Raphael Lemkin did us an ambiguous service, to say the least, by advancing the concept of genocide. And he did so because, for the reasons he quite rightly summarized, the concept has occluded or obscured, even legitimated, a wanton use of weapons that must cause civilian damage. I agree, and in what you quoted, Sophie, from my book now, 25 years old or so, 35 years old, almost. The distinction seems to me between victims, innocent. I mean, the only way we've made that distinction work is when we said that innocent victims don't wear uniforms. That was the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions distinction. The World War II obscured that because the concept of collateral damage came in British discussions and American discussions before the war began about the use of air power on civilians. And as Dirk says, collateral damage has sort of faded. It's been transformed into mowing the grass, or to bug splat, as he calls it. And it's intrinsic to modern warfare, at least so far. Maybe cyber war will transform some of this. So Dirk argues, secondly, first, that genocide is the crime of crimes, has trivialized the notion of civilian damage. He also argues that focusing on the ethnic or religious dimension of atrocities obscures the political side. I agree with that. I'm never quite clear in using the term genocide whether it should apply to Cambodia's Khmer Rouge, which is, after all, a political regime's destruction of perhaps 1 million of its own people. Or if we go back in history, what do we do with efforts to wipe out Protestants, like St. Bartholomew's Night, which seems almost quaint now? And mostly, what do we do about the 500,000 or so Indian communists who were massacred in, I think it's 1966 or 65? And we were happy to see that happen, I think. So it downgrades many massacres as mere crimes against humanity. And I think Dirk argues, and I agree, that crimes against humanity is quite a noble concept. It allows for considering all the ambiguous cases, in many that genocide as such does not. So I have many points of agreement with this, including the basic impulse. Dirk's ideology, if you follow the paper, I haven't read the rest of the book, is the Lemkin definition. He then attributes quite a bit of causal impact to Benjamin Ferenc's prosecution of the Einsatzgruppe group at Nuremberg in the second degree trials, the UN resolution. And then he generalizes, and this is where I will come back to, because I'm less convinced, the notion of general settler colonialism as an attributive, as a causal factor. So what the distinction, as he says in summary, between genocide and political violence blinds us to civilian destruction in general and its circumstances. And he raises that on page 7 and page 25 of the paper that we were all since. When I wrote on this, I don't think Dirk may not have seen it. It was published in the Journal of the International Red Cross. I was concerned with another distinction which I thought obscured civilian violence, and that is the fixation on the atomic bomb rather than generalized civilian bombing as somehow a threshold which was crucial. Because, you know, even if we accept the Tokyo bombing, just to take one spectacular instance, probably killed more than the Hiroshima bombing, certainly more than the Nagasaki bombing. I don't think to the dead, of course, why and how this is administered is less crucial. But in other words, we can fixate in American discussions and elsewhere about Hiroshima and obscure Dresden and Tokyo. And that was behind the quote you did. So certain distinctions, certain almost metaphorical claimants for atrocity seize our attention. I don't know how many in this group, probably many of you have read Donald Bloxham's book on the Nuremberg trials. I was unhappy with that book in one respect, and that is, and maybe I misread it, but Bloxham, whom I've never met, faults Nuremberg for not distinguishing the Holocaust or genocide from war crimes and crimes against humanity in general. I've taught Nuremberg. I've looked at the arguments, and it's clear that Robert Jackson clearly had a notion of crimes against humanity that included what we would call the Holocaust. He mentions Jewish victims, often others do too. So it's not that they were obscured by Nuremberg. The crimes against humanity, I think, is capacious as a legal concept. And Dirk mentions this when he talks about the jurisprudence that was available after World War I, had it been applied. I mean, we left it to the tail end of the Ottoman regime and to the Germans at Leipzig to conduct trials. And these were, of course, not situations in which trials could really be conducted. So anyway, all this is fine. And I'm right on with Dirk on all of this. But let me add some points. First of all, I think the genocide concept is problematic, and then it makes victims, people who feel their victimhood, want to be victims of genocide. It's sort of a badge of honor, which the international community now bestows or recognize. So, the Irish, the Ukrainians, Native Americans, I'm not saying these are all victims of tremendous violence, but I'm not sure that they're all victims of genocide. Is the Holodomor, the Ukrainian famine, which is pretty purposefully arranged by or abetted by Stalin, is that a genocide? I'm not sure Stalin really had a concept of Ukrainians as a as a people, cultural people, he wanted to eliminate. I think Anne Applebaum now feels it is a genocide, and so in this sense too, I don't think genocide helps us. People want to have that rank of honor and victimhood. I think the problem with genocide is a concept which also has difficulties, cultural genocide. Lemkin at some point said, yes, he thought cultural destruction was genocide. I believe in body counts, actually. The dead don't have a chance to re-arise and seize their culture. I think it allows that genocide becomes a figurative term, or that allows far too much of a blurring of concepts. I think killing is what distinguishes it, genocide. This is, we have a good term for what's happening to the Rohingya, what happened to Croatians or Bosnians, I should say, in the ex-Yugoslavia, and that is ethnic cleansing, which can, run all the way from just frightening people so they leave town to just murdering enough of them so that raping enough of them so that they leave town. And in this sense, I think I worry about muddying the waters. Genocide has become too ambiguous a term in what it designates. Now, that said, I do think there are distinctions which need to sometimes be seized more, in which genocide perhaps makes an effort to use. Planning and premeditation. Is the fury of a mob to be distinguished from the long-term concept or semi-long-term concept of actually killing? We know that the road to Auschwitz was a twisted one, as was said. It emerged over time, that is killing, but there was an ideological bias that helps lead toward it. Should planning, state involvement make a difference? I'm not going to answer that here. What about, again, there are issues the Australians have, as Dirk well knows, have debated and worried about the notion of taking Aborigines out of families, and we took Native Americans out of families, kids, to be educated in non-Native American schools. For Lemkin, this should certainly count as cultural genocide, but it's not quite the same. As you can see, I am very much in favor of trying to draw distinctions, and it seems fastidious at times and perhaps excessive, but I believe as historians we have to do for it. Now, that said, let me just finally suggest, I don't think Dirk's concept of permanent security does the heavy lifting he needs for this. It's too vague. It doesn't have a ready reference. If he has time, I would ask him to rethink that. We'd all love permanent security. We all know it's not possible. I would almost call it transcendent security rather than permanent security. Dirk, I just think you're going to, the title will not grab in the sense for what you're trying to get at. You can see Otto Ollendorf, you cite, and others too. We have to kill the children because they'll grow up into adults who want revenge. Still, I would urge you to rethink that title. And that concept. Now, is the ultimate cause of these massacres or atrocities against people of a different, I would still say, ethnicity, all due to settler colonialism? It's true that colonists encounter so-called Aboriginal or First Peoples, as the Canadians call them, which is a term I like, and they devastate them. They're often or the colonists will often arrive in much more density, not always. But there are cases. It doesn't seem to me that all cases of what we still call genocide go back to that type of mentality. You've tried to generalize it by using the concept of civilizational consciousness that the Westerners imposed, that in a sense they were orientalizing all of victims of genocide. I think maybe that argument is made more tightly and more fully in the later chapters of the book, but I think I'd ask to consider whether there are or not exceptions. You don't want to deflate one concept just to inflate another. And second, finally, I would say at the end, and don't we need some specific concept about a mass murder of an ethnic group for its ascriptive qualities, for having existed there as a group? I mean, I don't like genocide, but I don't know quite how to live without it as a concept. It's not necessarily worse than mass murder. The notion of that you're quite right to hierarchize it as the crime of crimes is counterproductive, maybe non-ethical. But I do think it's a specific type of motivated mass murder. And Lemkin was groping for a category for something which he saw as pretty much maybe at fault, unprecedented in his experience. And he came up with this one, and then he wanted to patent it and use it for many things. I don't quite know what to call it. I would argue, in a sense, try and purify it or reduce it, or just say, just keep on reminding people when it's used. It isn't the only crime. And then we need to debate. I think we need to go back, as I tried to do in 2005, to this issue of mass bombing. Aerial warfare is what distinguished 20th century warfare, and ask how in these wars could we have fought them differently? I mean, when you look at the debates in Britain in 41, 42, the bomb was the only way that in a sense the British could feel, and Churchill was aware of this, that they had some way of getting back at what was happening, as some weapon against Germans. So I don't think we're ever going to eliminate civilian violence. I don't think this notion of getting back, of achieving parity in a different type of asymmetric warfare is going to be with us. So this is the situation with the drones. I'm very worried about drone warfare, and it has all the possibilities that you mentioned. We don't know how to fight wars, actually, I think, in many ways. And so all these are problems that will continue to be there. But I would urge, specifically, this is a great book, I think, in many ways, but I would urge the title concept and the issue of settler colonialism be thought through a little further. Thanks. Open it up.
And I think is highly problematic in many ways. It leads to the issues that Professor Mayer raised, and unfortunately, I have not read the article, the International Review of the Red Cross, and I will find it and stick it in because I do have time to make some changes to this book. To the issue of the dilemma which we're faced with, the moral dilemma of trying to win a war and feeling that the civilians of the enemy are a military target, and that's how many aerial bomber theorists, air war theorists, reason throughout the 20th century, and I find it highly troubling. And we're no longer in the era of Second World War borrowing the Korean War style, which was much in that pattern, won't be repeated. Vietnam won't be repeated, where we're just dropping B-52s are dropping hundreds of thousands of bombs. Now things are surgical. in comparison. But what I'm suggesting is that given the collateral damage permission, which is in international humanitarian law, in other words, which permits collateral damage of civilians if a military target, if they are incidental to the targeting of a military object, so long as it's proportionate, that allowance in the context of a global war on terror, in which police actions in putting down insurgencies, but also preemptively, is an ongoing mode of operation, and i.e. forever. We're licensing the continuous serial mass killing of civilians around the world in the name of pacifying the world. Now, that's what I call liberal permanent security. And that, I think, is highly troubling. And by fetishizing genocide as that which we should be talking about, we're forgetting about what's actually going on now. Genocide, as occurred in the Second World War, was quite rare. But what's the regular state violence that's been licensed by the assumptions in international criminal law and humanitarian law? So it's a full frontal critique of the basic assumptions of my colleagues down the corridor in the law school, who'd often, they read this text and are a bit confused because they take the UN Charter and all these conventions as a starting point. And historians like me and Guillaume, who's written a lot on the formulation of the Nuremberg indictments, we're asking, how did these, and Kirsten as well has written on the concept of crimes against humanity, like, how did these concepts even emerge? What was included, what was excluded? So, because we're historians, it's important that this conversation take place, but it does often lead to misunderstandings and dissonances. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be having it, of course.
Okay. Charlie, do you want to
Well, I think the malice versus indifference is important. It does lead to gray areas. If we know people, we could rescue people and we don't, is that malice or is that indifference? When ships with refugees are kept at sea and people are dying on them, is that malice or indifference? It's not quite, these are border concepts that are not easy to deal with. I think it's not just the double effect which legitimated mass bombing or mass killing. It is mass bombing. It is also the notion that when you didn't know which victim, who would be victimized, we went into a situation, we're bombing Munich or Augsburg or wherever, Hanoi. We could say, well, yes, 10% of the kids who live in this area may die. But since we don't know which 10%, I think that the link of the victim to the perpetrator is fatally weakened. If we understood which 10%, but we run our insurance industries on this type of statistical basis, and so we mow the grass on this type of statistical basis. And I think it's easier for the people making these decisions because they can't assign which person in advance is going to die with this. This is one of the reasons I think we got anesthetized to this type of warfare. It's just a different sort of observation. If we asked the commander of the 8th Air Force to, he's accepting that X% of people will die in this. If we asked him to pick out X% of a population and have them lined up against a wall and shot, probably he would have said that's criminal. So I think much depends upon the context in which we see the framing of these decisions. And I think Dirk, and you might reflect on that a bit more, and when you have, if you have a chance in the later part of the book. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Barak, do you want to ask your question, please? Thank you, Charles.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Moses, for your presentation. And I hope this question is not too cheeky, since I've only listened to you and I haven't obviously had the chance to read the book yet. I'm wondering if you could perhaps maybe explain a bit more to those of us who aren't specialists. It seems that you kind of have two arguments going on. One is that you're saying that the law itself has not kept up with changes in warfare. At the same time, or are you saying also that our concepts of warfare have not kept up with or in sync with what's actually happening on the ground now, and that the gap in both the law and our concepts toward the sort of war that's taking place, this permanent security that you mentioned, that an absence of understanding what's actually happening is giving the state a free pass to basically commit genocide, in your words. Is that would that encapsulate essentially what you're trying to say? And
it's heading in that direction. It's not, I mean, I'm suggesting we dispense with the language of genocide, okay? But that in the context of a global war on terror or imperial expansion in the 19th century, which was justified in similar terms, creating a world safe for trade, private property, and pacifying insurgencies, piracy, and so forth. That if that becomes a continuous praxis, and that in the name of this pacification, killing lots of civilians is acceptable, then you're accepting that it's legal and normative to kill lots of civilians all the time, even if it's small numbers. It's not Holocaustal or like the Rwandan genocide, 800,000 people in a couple of weeks, but it's ongoing in time, and the problem is international law allows that, and B, why is it not a scandal? It's not a scandal because we're fixated on genocide as the optic of that which shocks the conscience of mankind. Now, the first couple of chapters in the book are a genealogy of these keywords, which are the keywords of the language of transgression, which I've not been able to get into, but talk about in great detail. And where did this vocabulary come from, that out of which genocide is itself a derivation, of which it's a derivation? And it's highly constructed and culturally particular, and although it's been universalized since the Second World War, and we need to understand where our sort of moral intuitions come from, rather than taking them as a starting point. Now, I've heard a couple of comments here where we must distinguish between this and that. Well, why is that? Well, it's sort of apodictively posited rather than actually argued for. And if historians start arguing like ethicists and in normative terms, then I think, well, we're actually really qualified. But obviously, there's a normative dimension to the book that's pretty obvious. But in the end, it's an historical reconstruction of how we inherited and derived this concept of genocide and its function in our moral intuitions and in our categories and hierarchicization, if you like, of international criminality. And it's a questioning of that, because I want to show what the blindnesses are, which you articulated quite well. That is, you identified, what the argument is. But I'm not trying to say this is all genocide. I'm saying the concept of genocide obscures the functioning of permanent security, which is, it's very simple. It's the aspiration of states and parastates for absolute security, which means that they're willing to countenance indiscriminate violence. Now, illiberal states like Nazi Germany and so forth are doing so for a bounded territoriality, okay? Even if the Nazi one grew and grew. And in the name of an ethnos, okay? And that's what we usually think of as genocide, right? liberal permanent security countenances indiscriminate killing of civilians in the name of humanity rather than a particular nation state, right? But in the name of humanity, it's expansive and much more ambitious in that sense, right? And that has, in a sense, been European colonialism since the late 15th century. In the name of Christendom or Christianity, later it becomes humanity. And these empires were also the progenitor of European and Western capitalism and then global capitalism. And then they lose control of it, of course. But if you read the speeches in the United Nations in the Security Council, those by Samantha Power and her colleagues in the a few years ago when she was there, it's like reading 19th century debates in the House of Commons. They talk about barbarism and civilization. Never before has there been such a stain on so forth. It's remarkable how stable this language is. And, genocide is just a derivation of that. I mean, there were always atrocity debates in the 19th and early 20th centuries, about colonial excesses, state excesses, the Russian suppression of Polish uprisings in the 1830s and 60s and so forth. If you just substituted some words, it would be exactly like the genocide debates today. I mean, I go into some detail about what the differences are, but there's a deep linguistic and affective history to the way we talk about atrocities and mass violence. And, international lawyers and political scientists don't usually look at that because they're fixated with the post-war world of the UN Charter and the Human Rights Revolution with its constituent parts, the Genocide Convention, the Human Rights Declaration, the Refugee Convention, of course, the Geneva Conventions, right? But these all have histories, as the historians here among us know. And they are, if you go into the drafting histories of these, into the sausage factory to see, what was left out, they all make exceptions for state security, and because they don't want to be hobbled by these conventions, so they make them as weak as possible. Okay. And that's much more interesting a story than a story of, upward teleological humanization of warfare and the restraint of the state. I don't see much state restraint. It's been redirected in certain ways. Okay, certain things have become intolerable in certain parts of the world, but then the violence necessary to reproduce these states is just modulated in a different way. But we ignore that because we're fascinated with the genocide concept and the Holocaust archetype. I mean, there are understandable reasons for this, but I think it's time we talked about it and came to terms with it. Now, when Professor Mayer wrote The Unmasterable Past, he was responding to the Historikerstreit in Germany, which many of you know about, in which this debate was coming a bit too soon and from the wrong quarters in German politics. So there were actually some quite interesting arguments from Ernst Nolte about state violence in the 19th century, but it was done in the service of, a revived German nationalism and, a lack of critical reflection about what had led to the Nazi seizure of power and what that regime did. And Professor Mayer's book and other interventions were an important correction to that. But that's now a long time ago, and Germany is a different place. So I think we can revisit some of those debates in a way that's not, it is not apologetic in the negative sense that Nolte intended.
Okay. Yeah. Professor Meyer, do you want to add in?
Oh, I just, yes, I mean, the debate in the mid-'80s was the question of exculpation through relativizing something, and that's not the political context today. Two generations of Germans have been educated in this in a pretty thorough way. I do think you mentioned Congo, and that's huge violence. Is that state violence? At a certain point, you get the breakdown of a state. Can breed as much violence as the state itself. I wouldn't apply to genocide to it. But I mean, if we're concerned primarily about number, the quantity of deaths, so to speak, mass death, atrocities. I think you have to give some scrutiny to the breakdown of states, and that I'm not trying to return to the the non-civilized, the rhetoric of non-civilization which characterized imperialism. Breakdowns of states can occur for other reasons, as they did with Yugoslavia in the early 90s. I think so. I would just ask you to consider that. My major argument is, Dirk, is that I'm not sure permanent security grabs as much of the phenomenon. It has enough specificity to do what you want to do in isolating this. But we can talk about that ourselves.
Okay.
Otherwise, there are ironies here. One of the most effective books about the Nazis was Victor Trinin's book in 1944 about Nazi criminality. It reads a little like Lemkin. It is, however, and it was decisive in, I think, gave a major push forward to the London negotiations that were trying to frame an indictment for the post-war trials against the Germans. Victor Trinin was, I believe, Jewish. He writes a very good book. He was also Wyszynski's chief prosecutorial assistant in the purges of 1936, 37, and 38. So it's just one of the ironies of history, how we can be selective about this stuff.
When we speak about a hierarchization of crimes and I think that, and it's also taking, and it's a problem now because we are at the crossroads of historiography. And I think it's very also important also to maintain, when we compare genocide or when we speak about hierarchization, we should always take into consideration the context, and because if we compare all the genocides and if we state that there is a kind of hierarchy, which maybe, and I mean it has also a political incidence, and it's like if we the political incidence could be like, it's like you could also say that so when we look at Elie Wiesel, for example, or Simone Weil, what they were writing about the Holocaust or the genocide, they said that there is a risk, and there's a risk emerged in the 60s, that we kind of forget also the uniqueness of every genocide, and this is very important. And then there is a political shift that that could be turned into could become political, and I think it's a problem. So I think that your arguments is very interesting, but we should also pay very attention to the use of settler colonialism as a crime of mass murder.
I devoted most of my little presentation to trying to summarize your points, and then adding a few. And I suggested one that what Sophie just said, that one problem you could add to the problematic of genocide is that we don't always know when it. How do we evaluate it? People want to be victims of genocide in the sense to raise their own status of victimhood. The Ukrainian Holodomor seems to me a major example here. But I also thought, you go from a specific, what I call etiology, from Lemkin through Ferenc, the UN, etc. Where how this term gets into currency and is used and becomes accepted. But then you searching for it, I think you may overinflate. I worry about for you, genocide is both too narrow and it's also too broad. I don't think settler colonialism. I mean, there are probably instances of genocide which won't fall under your concept of settler colonialism. There are genocides, in a sense, within Europe. I'm not. I know you can you try to do this with the whole notion of Orientalism and civilizational discourses. I just wanted you to think whether this is not perhaps overgeneralizing the causal background of concept.
Yeah.
But I realize it's important to your book. It would be one way I would react to it.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's a dangerous throwaway line early into an introduction, which I think you might be reacting to, and it's not fleshed out there. It's in that sense it's dangerous, whereas other parts of the book go into some detail about settler colonialism being a modality of liberal permanent security, because it's the vehicle of, particularly in the British Empire, but also in some of the Iberian empires, of quote unquote spreading Christendom and civilization was through settler colonialism. So North America,
Right.
Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth.
Briefly, because the Iberians, even before they got to their empire, were preoccupied about limpieza del sangue, purity of blood, the forced conversion, quasi-forced conversion of Jews, Muslims. I mean, they really are hung up on, on a sort of a genetic blood type transmission of things, even before they get to wipe out Indians and conquer Mesoamerica. So and this is one of the problems I have also with settler colonialism. I don't think the German cruelty, Fantrota in Namibia, is which is a sort of Armenian type of tactic of driving these people into the desert. I don't think that explains Hitler, although some people have tried to draw a straight line. Their intentionality, what is said about intentionality, I don't know this. There is a racial type of stigmatization about Jews on the Holocaust and other people elsewhere, and this is why I worry about that. At the end of the day, what you may end up is, we're going to throw out a lot with the bathwater, so to speak. And I asked at the end, don't we need something? Wouldn't we be inventing something like genocide, even if we hadn't done it, in a certain sense, faced with the specificity of violence against what we could call ascriptive groups who pre-exist the conquest or the assimilation or whatever? Aren't we going to need a concept for dealing with trying to get rid of these groups as such?
It's an amazing presentation. I like so much. It's very interesting for me because I'm researching on Congo now, Free State of Congo. But I have was very nice your last speech at the end of your presentation. You said that it's very important who define the category of genocide. Do you think that it's necessary also to think about how this category was changed during the time? Also, who defined the category and with what purposes? Because we have the UN at some moment, but we have very well-known genocides in the first half of the century, and also because it's you trace this concept to the 16th century. I think also it's important to understand what purposes, how it changed, how political uses have this category. We have a crazy conversation going on at the same time we have your presentation. I just give a glance, but it's important to understand who defined the category, as you said, but also with these purposes, because we have an master institution, the UN, but excuse me. At the same time, different subjects appropriate of this category. I remember in Argentina, after the dictatorship, the human rights associations, and I was part of this, we use the category of genocide to describe what is going on. But I think that this is not something that the UN accept, because it's more an internal crisis or internal war. That's it.
Okay, I think I know what you're getting at. I mean, you've worked with Daniel, I have him in the footnote. Daniel in South America, in Argentina, works on genocide and extending its definition to political groups.
Hello, I made a presentation of my last book last week for the first session of this seminar. I am a French historian based in Berlin and working on post-war periods, on war crime trials, and so on. So I find the thesis of Dirk very interesting, and it's a remark on what he said. What he said about genocide is in line, which was I wrote in this in my last book about the crime against humanity. I think that the concept of genocide was transformed into a legal category after the war in 1948. It was transformed into a legal category in such a way that it did not pose a threat to the sovereignty of the signatory states, such as imperial or colonial powers. And moreover, unlike a crime against humanity, genocide was not linked to an effective judicial practice. No court was responsible for applying the genocide concept until the end of the 90s. It contributed also to make weak this concept. It's a general remark. I don't know what Dirk think about that. Thank you.
Dirk, do you want to react or?
Well,
sure. I mean, there's a couple of things on the table now. So, no, I agree with Guillaume, who I had the pleasure of meeting in Berlin a few summers ago, and reading his work on the UN War Crimes Commission, which is the precursor to the formulation of the London Charter by the Big Three. I agree that the purpose of these, when the purpose of these concepts when they're institutionalized is to give a free hand to states, especially the colonial states and great powers, so that their sovereignty isn't really affected. Now, a lot of people, realist international relations scholars, have pointed that out. This is not a new idea, but it's historically important to show how that comes to be. Now, Roberto, where'd you go? There you are. You're referring, if I recall, to the prosecution of those generals' regimes in Latin America that persecuted leftists, Jews, and others, by expanding the concept of genocide to include those kind of political victims, sometimes by ethnicizing them, but pointing out family networks were targeted, children of dissidents were targeted. So they weren't guilty themselves, but they were related to people who are considered politically guilty. So there was kind of a sanguinary nature or dimension to the political persecution. Now, my reaction to this is why do people in Latin America, in Argentina, feel the need to add gravitas to the terrible crimes committed against their friends in this case, by expanding the concept of genocide. But it's not an ethnic crime. Why not use crimes against humanity? As Professor Mayer said, it's bad enough, you know. So I'm really interested in why actors in your case, you know, your circle there, feel that compulsion to try to engage in conceptual stretching, as some political scientists put it. Likewise, you know, why do proponents of Ukrainian Holodomor memory, why are they so adamant that this must be considered a genocide, and if it's not, then we failed? So the symbolic stakes here are just fascinating and troubling, because there's this sense that if we can't make the genocide label stick, we then sink into invisibility, you know, which is an unbearable experience for people who are traumatized or vicariously traumatized. Now, how did we get into this situation? I mean, that's one of my basic questions. And, you know, well, you know, then we need to understand historically, how was it that genocide came to be posited as the crime of crimes? And, you know, what's excluded from our optic? You know, what's not on the radar? Yeah, and so I think we need to step back from this game of labeling things genocide and not play this game, but try to play another game, which is trying to understand what state and parastate security violence, or where it comes from. Now, I take Professor Meyer's point about mass violence, and the breakdown of states as you get in Congo. I mean, I mentioned Congo in the introduction, as you know, precisely because it doesn't fit a genocide optic of perpetrators and victims in a sort of simple binary way. You know, it's a multi-directional. I mean, it's not even an armed conflict in a conventional way. We have here warlords competing for resources, which are networked themselves to global players who want to use these minerals to make cell phones to a large extent. It's a very complicated story. But there are security dimensions here in many ways as well. So I am positing as a master concept security in particular modalities. You know, every person has a right to personal security. You know, people are now talking about cosmopolitan environmental security. I mean, it can be nice if you like, but the kind of security that I think leads to excesses against civilians, which is what I'm interested in explaining, is permanent security. The idea that your polity, however defined, or humanity, can be rendered safe forever in time. Now, that is quite a common ambition in states, and I think that's the driver of all these other phenomena that we've named as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, or as the UN Special Rapporteur puts it, atrocity crimes, which also includes ethnic cleansing. I mean, the one reason the UN's had to go down this path of inventing this non-legal category of atrocity crimes is because these other criminal categories don't really work anymore, and so they don't work rhetorically, and legally they're very slippery as well and overlap, and crimes against humanity overlap in many parts as well. So they're constantly looking for fixes rather than engaging in a fundamental legal, historical / philosophical questioning of the moral and legal basis of the global post-war order, which is sort of falling apart at the moment. Mm-hmm. So I'm not interested in the game of categorizing things as genocide or not. It's that game that's the problem.
Okay, great, thank you. Professor Meyer, do you want to respond also, or?
No, I agree with that, much of that. My only critique is I think the notion of permanent security is just going to be too bland to wait. I mean, in a certain sense, it's exclusionary security, it's competitive security, and it can be even paranoid, but there's some dimension beyond the temporal, which comes into it. But you know, it's right. You know, we are it's like a boat that's leaking, this concept, and we're patching it here and there with different case. Each case needs a new patch, and as a result, it's not very satisfactory anymore. But whatever the patch is, you know, we're always going to have difficulty of what's in and what's out. And there'll always be gray areas. I mean, as I said, you know, if you're indifferent, this is the whole problem of the bystander in a different historical frame. What level of guilt or level of exculpation can we award or ascribe to the bystander? You know, when I guess it was George Bush didn't go down to New Orleans for the Katrina catastrophe. Is he a bystander? If President Trump totally, you know, ups our pretty appalling death tolls from this virus because of his way of running a government, is, you know, should he be put on trial? Unfortunately, we tried that; it didn't quite work. But you know, I think this is the problem with all these concepts. We're always going, and with all criminal prosecutions, we just, you know, and it's the problem with that comment. I don't know who made it, but intentionality all the way through. That's not easy.